I'm going to start this morning with a talk that I have never given before and that I'm quite excited to give. And it's going to be a bunch of my takes, quite strongly opinionated takes on what research I think matters and how to do research that matters. I think actually for many people, this is, okay, I'll caveat by saying that first of all, you might think, well, what is Lewis, what has he got to say about this? Because he is only himself a mere PhD student. And that is true. And also, many of the things I'm going to say to you are going to sound really, really obvious. And yet, I, despite being so keen on them and thinking them so important, still routinely forget or don't kind of incorporate these into my kind of own research practices and the way I prioritize research and so on. It's very easy just to go chasing after shiny things that are immediately in front of you, or like ideas that sound cute but that don't mean anything, because that's fun. And doing research is a lot about having fun. But some of us, I think, probably most of us in this room, are interested in doing research that is not just fun, research that matters. And so, yeah, I think even if it sounds obvious, it's actually quite hard to kind of follow this advice. And I myself have failed to do so many times in the past, and I continue to fail to do so. So hopefully you will do better than I will. Yeah, it's a relatively short talk. I also welcome pushback, and I'm going to leave questions till the end. And if you want to chat about any of this stuff afterwards, you can. But with that said, I'm going to jump straight in so that we're hopefully on time for our first speaker in about 20 minutes. How to do research that matters. First thing, what matters? What is it for something to matter? What is it for research to matter? Why would research matter or not? Okay, what makes research important? Let's think about that first. Does anyone know who this person is on the screen? You're going to get bonus points if you do. Okay, all right, no hands. In fairness, I probably also would not have known. I couldn't remember exactly what he looked like. This is Richard Hammond. Who you may have heard of, so Hamming of like Hamming codes, Hamming distance, but also like way more than that. He won one of the first Turing Award winners. He was one of the first Turing Award winners. He worked on the Manhattan Project. He then went to Bell Labs. He did a bunch of amazing stuff. Very inspirational guy. And he has this fantastic talk called You and Your Research. It's a lecture that he gave relatively late in his career. You can go watch it on YouTube. It's not that long. I very much encourage you to do so. And he has this wonderful quote from it, which is, if you're not working on an important problem and it's not likely to become important, then why are you working on it? And this is a question that he would genuinely ask people that he was working with in Bell Labs. And I think it's a good question. So the immediate thing that it raises, of course, well, what does it mean for a problem to be important? Important for what? And that, a problem might be important for many things. So it might be, your research might be important for your salary. That could be important. Maybe more so, thinking about your kind of academic reputation, if that's something you're trying to build as a kind of early career researcher, that's also going to be kind of important. Your happiness, I think, now we're getting somewhere. This is kind of more what it's about, I think. But the thing I'm going to be talking about is this, your positive impact on the world. And I'm going to be primarily talking about this, although, of course, it's not to say these other things aren't important, and it's also to concede that, unfortunately, much of the time, they will trade off against each other, which is, a sad comment on the state of the world, but there we are. Okay, next thing I want to talk about, theories of change. So some of you who are maybe like more familiar with kind of like strategy type things or whatever will have come across this notion of a theory of change. Theory of change, essentially, you can think of it almost like a kind of flowchart-esque kind of like diagrammatic picture of how the things that you are doing are going to lead to the changes and the effects that you want to see in the world. And I think an incredibly valuable thing is to develop a theory of change for your own research. So Michael Aird has a wonderful talk on this. I can share you a link later if you'd like. But as an example for this, let's just think about something in the kind of cooperative AI setting. I'm borrowing something from Jesse here, where what Jesse and his colleagues did in this paper is to kind of break down the sources of kind of inefficiency in kind of bargaining problems and so on, down into a set of kind of constituent parts, break those further down, etc., until you have these kind of core things like kind of, okay, miscoordination, perceived risk of punishment, kind of unconditional disclosure of information being infeasible, etc. So you kind of break the problem down, and then you attack one of these kind of smaller parts with the knowledge that, or with the understanding that, this is going to feed into the broader picture. But it's very easy just to attack one of these parts, or attack something that looks like one of these parts, without fitting it into this broader picture, and therefore without necessarily understanding how your research is going to make a difference, which bits are most important to prioritize, and so on, how to break things down like this. So this is a very helpful exercise. Again, cribbing something from some earlier slides of Jesse's, we can also incorporate this sort of thinking into a kind of research kind of process or flow and so on for doing things, like a kind of pattern. So, one way of doing things, for example, is thinking about like, okay, so we first need to think about what are the underlying conditions that are required for cooperation. We then need to think about the kind of cooperative properties that those conditions are going to kind of lay the groundwork for, and so on. But then, of course, importantly, in order to know that we're actually doing anything useful, we need scalable evaluation of those properties. We need to be able to check that we're doing something. And so again, you have this kind of structured flow that indicates where the gaps in your current kind of research pattern might be and how to go about addressing them. Okay, so coming up with a theory of change is important, and I think that feeds more generally into your own agenda. And it might come across as like a little bit weird to suggest that you all ought to have a research agenda at this point, because many of you are either junior researchers or have not even really started doing that much research yet. Some of you have been doing research for a little while, obviously. But even if you're only just starting out, I think it's an incredibly, incredibly useful exercise, it has been for me personally and other people I know who've tried this, to actually kind of come up with and continually refine. Obviously, the first time you kind of come up with this is probably going to be terrible. At least it was for me. So refining your own kind of personal research agenda. I think this is especially important for those of you who are considering kind of actual kind of research careers, where in your PhD, you should not, if you want your own kind of solid research career, necessarily just be following on from what your supervisors are doing, right? You should be really kind of pushing the envelope in a bit more. You should not necessarily just be extending their research agenda. You should have your own research agenda. And this agenda should explain how and why your research matters. So in our case, this would be a theory of change for creating a positive impact. How this agenda fits into what other people are working on. This is critical if you don't want to be scooped and if you want to know who the people are working on various things. And also if you want to collaborate as well. It's not necessarily a competitive thing. It's about collaboration as well. And finally, and almost kind of most importantly, how the projects you are doing fit into that agenda. So when I came up with my own kind of like little mini agenda of the stuff that I was doing, I then looked back at the projects that I was working on at the moment, and it didn't make any sense. Like there was like very weak justification for why I'd be working on the projects that I was working on relative to the agenda that I kind of wanted to be pursuing or like thought I ought to pursue. And so that led me to kind of like flipping my priorities in quite a big way and just ditching some of those projects or like wrapping them up and not pursuing them further, etc. Because I realized that actually it was not going to be important for what I wanted to achieve. This exercise as well is both directly useful for thinking about like planning research and being able to pitch your ideas, and eventually maybe some of you will end up on like the faculty job market or something like this, or like having to give a job talk at a company or even start a new org to pursue part of your research agenda or something like this. But it's also indirectly useful in that this is an extremely kind of good exercise for thinking about kind of how to prioritize your research, how to step back, look at what you're doing, ask why you're doing it, and take that question very seriously. Relatedly, there's sometimes a distinction drawn between two kinds of research. This is very crude approximation, but I think it broadly holds true. One of those types of research is called goal-driven research, or top-down, which involves figuring out where you want to go, identifying where you want to go, and then figuring out how to get there. Second kind of research, sometimes called bottom-up research or idea-driven research, involves following the literature and coming up with some new ideas that haven't been tried yet. And my claim is that you should ideally be pursuing goal-driven research, even if that means only taking small steps towards the goal, right? So you might have this big ambition, and you might not necessarily be able to solve it, especially if it's a big, important problem. Big, important problems are very hard to solve. But this is better than, I think, than kind of just filling in the kind of like convex hull of like research that already exists, like extending things that already exist in little directions, just trying to like think of like gaps, like, oh, who hasn't tried that, or like what about this, and so on. That's it can still be very useful, don't get me wrong, and this is also much easier as well to do it this way, right? Because with the goal-driven thing, okay, first identifying the goal, maybe that's okay, but you have to really understand what the landscape of problems look like and how this theory of change is going to work, and then you have to figure out like tractable bits of that problem and go on how to solve it. That's very hard, but I think it's important to try and do, and this is how you actually end up kind of making like a bigger difference, I think, rather than just kind of being another paper on another thing that just kind of looks like, well, what if we tried this but that, and so on. And don't get me wrong, I've done like most of all the research I've ever done has been idea-driven. And that's okay as well. Like, I don't know, you start out on your research career, this is like very natural thing to start by doing. But I think the more I've gone into goal-driven, the more I feel kind of excited about my own research, the more I feel like my research is actually going to make any sort of difference at all, where the baseline is that it probably won't. Cool, okay. Second thing of 3, doing research. This is just going to be like a list of some things, some tips, and some ideas that I find useful for thinking about how to do research. I will also mention right now, this feels like a good time to say this, that many of the things that I'm talking about right now are stolen directly without credit from lots of other people's writings on how to do research effectively. I actually have a blog post on this, or like a forthcoming blog post which covers some of these topics on the slides, where I link to all of these amazing resources from all of these fantastic, esteemed, much smarter than I am researchers. And unfortunately, when I was like copying quotes from them, I initially just did this as my own notes, so I didn't actually attribute things very well to people during the course of taking my own notes. But I do have like a massive list of a bunch of things that you can read, which go into way more detail about many of these things. So I'm selecting some things that I found helpful for me, but these resources have tons of stuff in which you might find much more helpful for you. So let me know if you want me to share that with you afterwards. Okay, doing research, 3 stages. First, finding problems. Sounds really stupid and obvious, but to get important results, you need to ask important questions. And I'm thinking kind of like important at the level of like, how might this change the like trajectory of civilization level? Not like, how can I, make people's like experience using their like iPhones like better or whatever. Though that is in some ways, potentially important. Lots of people have iPhones, lots of people have phones, all of this sort of thing. But that's like kind of low stakes, right? I'm thinking about like big picture stuff right now, and I think you ought to be thinking about big picture stuff too. Look for messy and confusing areas. Look for things where people sound like they haven't really figured out the best way to talk about this yet, or they don't really know what's going on. This is often like a key indicator of something that's kind of like ripe to be like clarified, discovered, kind of worked on, and it's likely to be pretty fresh, and no one else is necessarily going to know what they're talking about either, so you'll be in a prime position to like swoop in and save the day. I love this piece of advice, not mine. Don't invent problems. If you can't think of at least 3 examples of your problem, then it's probably not a real problem. And time again, I have like tried to do this with problems I've come up with and have failed. It's a good little litmus test. Something else. If you can't do something, e.g. because you don't have enough compute, I'm sure you're as all kind of like compute constrained kind of students and these sorts of things, this might be a pretty regular occurrence for you. If you can't do something, ask why not. Turn getting around the problem that you're encountering with being able to pursue this thing as the thing you're actually trying to solve. I think this is a really nice idea. And then I also want to say that actually something just like finding a new, different lens on a problem can itself be a kind of meaningful contribution and so on. There's lots of ways to make progress on research that don't look like, there's lots of ways to make important contributions that don't look like kind of conventional blah, 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 like setting, motivation, methodology, results, blah, 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 type work. And you don't necessarily have to fall into that pattern to do impactful things. And in fact, many of the more impactful bits of research are in fact things that look a bit like this kind of reframing, adopting a different lens, joining to different areas, and so on. Okay, second of 3 things, So finding problems, prioritizing problems. So you found a bunch of problems, and some of them seem okay. How should you prioritize them? First thing, which is pretty obvious, is like difficulty is not necessarily a good indicator of importance. So don't just like try and solve something that seems like hard, because it might not matter. Instead, think about these things. Think about the areas opened up or the paths unlocked by this new result, if you were able to solve it, this new problem, if you were able to unlock it. Think about connections uncovered to other fields and other kind of disciplines, other ideas. Think about the questions actually raised by solving the problem. If you're able to show some kind of result, positive or negative or whatever, what new questions does that throw up? This is how progress is made. And also, of course, especially when you're earlier on in your career, you ought to as well pay some kind of attention to the skills gained in doing the thing. You know, a great way to like learn about a thing is to force yourself to do a project in that thing. And that's something I've done a bunch of times, like didn't know any RL, did a project in RL. Didn't know anything about causality, did a project in causality. Now I know about RL and causality. Great news, lucky me. Work on problems that are suited to you. Think about your comparative advantage. Again, this is just like super obvious advice, but like actually think about it. It took me maybe like 1.5 years as a PhD researcher before I kind of like realized like what I can do better when it comes to doing research or working on problems and papers compared to my colleagues, and also the things I couldn't do as well, right? And so I've sort of switched now a little bit into doing the things that I am a bit better at when it comes to research. But I could just have like never really noticed that, or like it took me a while to like pay attention to that. And I could have easily just like continued doing like just standard stuff without thinking about like actually no. Or this is also useful for thinking about collaborations and so on. Like what can you bring to the table? Some people like to call like, what is your like secret weapon almost? Like what is your unfair advantage that you have over other people, and how are you going to use that to deliver the most impactful results that you can? This is another of my favorite quotes. Incremental work is the worst adjective possible in academia. This is not my quote. I'm quoting someone else, but I like it. I think it's like to a first approximation correct. And this also relates quite closely to this idea of idea-driven versus like goal-driven research, though not entirely. One can think about incremental steps towards a goal, and that is not necessarily quite so bad. But yeah, it can be tempting, especially when you see people around you like writing lots of papers or publishing lots of things, et cetera, to get caught up in that rat race and to just try and like, think about quantity over quality. That is actually, A, not what matters for kind of actually making progress on things. And also B, when you get to things like applying for postdocs, applying for jobs, applying for whatever, this also like doesn't look good necessarily from the perspective of like hiring committees, right? Like if you're on a hiring committee, what you're looking for is they care about like the 2 or 3 like best things that you did in your PhD or in your like previous research career or whatever. Like another piece of advice that I don't have on here, but like ideally after your PhD, or for instance, if you're going to do a PhD or something like this, if you're going to do a bit of research, you should be known as the person who did X, right? Where hopefully X is something like actually useful. But that's like one of the like best possible outcomes that can arise from your PhD. But X doesn't need to be like, tons of little different things. It could just be like one cool, really big thing. Like Ian Goodfellow, the guy who did GANs, right? Like things like this. Obviously, not any of us. We're not necessarily all Ian Goodfellows. That's fine. But I think it's worth thinking about what this means. And if you write one good paper a year, and it's really solid and chunky, and it's a meaningful contribution, you're smashing it. That's great. And I think many people decide that they want to try and do many more things than that, and then they end up going for quantity over quality. Okay, final bit on. Thanks, Walter. Final bit on solving problems. Sorry, I can't remember what this is about now. Maybe it was solving problems. Maybe this is also a slide is called solving problems. Anyway, whatever. Remain open to changing your approach. So like many of us, myself included, have like favorite framings, favorite methods. As soon as I hear a problem, I want to write it down in terms of, a particular model of a game or like a particular like learning problem or whatever it might be. And be open to like throwing that away and to trying something different. because that can often really help. It helps a lot more if you're working with someone as well who is used to adopting different frames or modeling problems in different ways and can help you see things from a different perspective. It's very useful. Be realistic. You're all early stage career, early kind of researchers and so on. Like solving big important problems is like really hard. You probably won't be able to do it. Or like at least like the big thing, like at least straight away, unless you're some like super genius, in which case you can just ignore everything I've been telling you anyway. So just that's fine though. So just balance work spent on important, difficult problems with smaller, more easily achievable results. And as you skill up on as a researcher, those bigger, important problems, you'll find them more and more tractable. And this is just like how you grow and gain kind of skills as a researcher. That's totally fine. This is a really nice piece of advice, which I think I cribbed from Jacob Steinhardt, who's a professor at Berkeley. So when you're thinking about a project and its component parts, which you should ideally be laying out in front of you before you actually get started on it, what you should do is you should work on the components of the project in the order from most to least informative per unit time. How should you measure that? You should measure that in terms of the failure rate expected from that bit, or the expected time saved, not necessarily by starting with the easiest part or the hardest part or something else. The idea being that if there's some component of the project where if it doesn't really work, the project is not really going to go anywhere, you should find that out first, right? And that might mean doing something, like starting with a few kind of, cheap experiments as opposed to like laying out some of the formal theory and like setting up the model and stuff like that. Maybe you should actually just kind of jump in halfway through to test if something is actually going to be like at all tractable before you decide to like embark on this project more generally. And this is more important when you start having more research ideas than you actually have time to work on. And there's like a changing point at some point during your kind of like research progress when this will happen. For some of you, it might have already happened. For some of you, it might not have happened just yet. That's totally fine. You're all at very different stages. This happened to me like maybe like, I don't know, 1 year into my PhD or like 1.5 years into my PhD, but some people it takes more time, some people it takes way less time. I met people on the first day of my PhD who were like, well, I've got these like 10 like problems and they were all like amazing, like cool research directions and they didn't have time to work on them. But yeah, so this is important for doing that when you get to that stage. And again, this is like such like standard boring advice that applies to like actually most things, but it's still just worth repeating because people routinely fail to take it into account, including me. It's far better to do an outstanding job on a moderately sized project than an average job on a large project. And again, this is about this quality over quantity thing. Okay, final thing I want to do. I realize I'm running a little bit over and I don't want to take up too much time of Ed's because it's going to it promises to be excellent, as always. Common failure modes, things that people do, like 3 things that people fail to take account of when selecting research problems when doing things like this. I'm going to run through this relatively quickly. There's going to be some examples. Okay, first thing, not paying attention to scaling and the bitter lesson. So some of you might have already, Noam's giving a talk later, he's a big proponent of the bitter lesson. He like tweets like semi-regularly about how people should be thinking about the bitter lesson. For those of you who aren't familiar with the bitter lesson, Google it. It's on Rich Sutton's website. You should actually read it. It's very, very short. And essentially, it's about how general-purpose methods that scale with increased computation tend to, over time, outperform more specific, handcrafted, unscalable methods. So this is very relevant, for example, when we think about the progress of deep learning, but people often over-index on that and think, oh, it's just all about machine learning, blah, blah, blah. But it's not. It's also about, one of the key things that Rich Sutton makes in this blog post, it's also about things like search as well, other sorts of kind of like algorithmic methods and techniques, etc., that tend to be pretty general and scale very well with computation. And these things are important. Okay, so what are some examples of work that you can do that does pay attention to scaling in the bitter lesson or is not really adversely affected by scaling in the bitter lesson? Well, one example might be the fact that meta-learning and model-free optimization in things like opponent shaping, you just throw more compute at the problem. You don't worry about like doing anything like clever or whatever. It just, eventually it just works. This is something people who worked on this thing can attest to. Another thing that isn't necessarily so affected by scaling the bitter lesson is things like interpretability, for example. Like just because something gets like more computation is used or there's some like bigger, more complex thing, sometimes that can almost make the thing less interpretable, right? And so working on interpretability is like a fine way to like avoid getting hit by scaling issues in the bit of lesson. Okay, what are negative examples? So what are things that I would not recommend doing if you want to take account of this? These are mostly historic examples. Okay, neural machine translation. Turns out that was a waste of time. No offense to anyone who worked on neural machine translation. It wasn't truly a waste of time, obviously. There was progress made. There were many insights gained and so on. But turns out we just shove enough data and enough compute at a large language model, and we get neural machine translation for free. Hooray. Other things. Learning to play cooperatively based on humans by kind of handcrafted representations of conventions and so on. Humans have all sorts of conventions, and it's important to take account of them, and it's highly non-trivial for machines to kind of interact with us and to pay attention to those conventions. But if with enough data about those conventions and with enough compute thrown at the problem, this kind of eventually kind of fades away. And some of this I'm kind of talking like, I'm not saying these problems are necessarily like solved right now. I'm saying we should expect them to fall out of general capabilities advances in the coming years. Okay, second of three kind of things that I think that people often fail on: unrealistic assumptions. So to make important problems tractable, you often have to introduce assumptions about those problems, right? This is just a natural thing you do. The trick is, of course, here to introduce good assumptions. What does it mean for an assumption to be good? Well, it depends on how closely the assumption corresponds to the problems that actually matter in the world. If you have to make some assumption about something which is then like, means that it only really applies to like small edge cases that no one really cares about or that don't make that much difference, then so what? And also thinking about how easily it can potentially be relaxed while preserving the solution that you come up with. Totally fine to make a bunch of assumptions, come up with a kind of like weaker version of the problem, as long as it's like clear that you've solved the core of the problem that much, and you can kind of, eventually do some you can leave someone else to like fill in the gaps or whatever, or like, you can do some follow-up work to like strengthen it, but yeah, that's a core idea. Okay, so positive examples, good assumptions that you might come up with. So not always the case, but like, maybe you want to adopt a mean field approach to thinking about population. So basically like take the limit of like an infinite number of agents. Of course, we don't have an infinite number of agents in practice, but often this is like a reasonable assumption, and you can kind of bound the difference between what you're coming up with and a large population of agents. Other things. Maybe you want to assume that a group of agents plays a Nash equilibrium at some point. Now that's actually can be quite unrealistic in many settings, because for various reasons that I'm not going to go into right now. But if you can kind of roughly like just plug in any other sort of solution concept and the thing pretty much just works the same, and it doesn't really matter that much, then that's totally fine. Stick with the Nash equilibrium, people use it, it's okay. Negative examples. Sometimes people are like, oh, how can I get my agents to cooperate? Well, I can just like perturb their reward function or whatever. I can give them a little bits of auxiliary rewards. I can make them care about this, that, and the other. But people take this too far. People just assume that like, oh, we can just do like more or less like arbitrary like changes to their objective functions and so on, and in a general sum setting. And like, why would that ever be the case? Why would you be able to do that? What is the mechanism via which you are going to enforce that? If I have my agent and you have your agent and we deploy them in the world, and I want my agent to be pursuing my objectives, you want your agent to be pursuing your objectives, why am I going to listen to someone who says, no, just tweak your reward function so that it like, cares more about that other agent or like does something else, right? That might be possible. We might be able to enforce that, but that's a strong assumption. And so often people who take this kind of top-down approach to solving these cooperation problems kind of ignore the fact that they have this privileged position of working on it as a kind of system designer that is just going to be totally unrealistic when it comes to real-world agents deployed at scale. Another silly example of this is like assuming that in your problem case, agents are going to have to learn to communicate with one another tabula rasa, by which I mean they're going to have no idea how to communicate. They're just going to have to figure this out by themselves. Blah, 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 blah. Like, once upon a time, maybe that's like a reasonable assumption. Now we have language models. There's just no way, there's no reason why this would be the case anymore. So like, don't make something a problem if it's not actually likely to be a problem. Right, final thing, and then I'll wrap up and pass on. Sorry for running late, Ed. Non-neglectedness. So when thinking about the impact of your work, I claim that what you should actually be thinking about is the counterfactual expected impact of your work. So expected means this can sometimes imply taking bigger bets, riskier bets, and so on. This is hard to do early in your research career because you're trying to build up progress, I think it's still worth doing, or like pushing yourself to go in that direction. Counterfactual thing is kind of more critical. The idea basically here is that if someone else is going to have soon solved the problem that you are solving anyway, then basically you didn't really make that much difference. And now lots of problems are going to get solved over time anyway. This is pretty natural. This is how science advances. And so it's more thinking about how much you accelerate things, how much of a difference you make in that sense. Yeah, this is like, if you want to actually have an impact in the world, then you should be thinking about your counterfactual impact. So therefore, you should be wary of problems that have lots of people working on them. Like stay away from crowded areas if you can. This will also improve your sanity as a PhD student, because you won't be having sleepless nights worrying about like all the other thousands of people working on exactly the same thing that you are working on, all trying to submit to NeurIPS, all looking to scoop each other and so on, which is a horrible position to be in. I know, I've been in it. Also tend to try to ignore problems that will be worth lots of money if they're solved. Why? Because people are already going to be trying to solve them, and people probably much more well-resourced than you, a PhD student. Other things. Try and ignore, to the extent that it's possible, problems that have lay unsolved for decades. I don't want to say this too strongly, because I actually do think that just, these problems do need fresh eyes, they do need attention and so on. And it's also, potentially the case that you can make progress and so on, and you can tackle these things. Sometimes other research advantages unlock things that you can then use to tackle these problems. And so this is a bit of a weaker advice, but especially when you're like starting out with your PhD, trying to like just tackle like the biggest outstanding problems in the field is like not necessarily a very sensible thing to do. And again, also because lots of other people have tried and mostly failed to do that. Okay, so what are some positive examples of like things that I think are like neglected, but that like, are important to work on from the point of view of cooperative AI? Stuff like understanding the implications of agents written in overlapping code for cooperation. So, maybe you have two agents distilled from like the same base model or whatever as a language model, and like, what does that imply for like how they're going to interact with one another? Very, very few people are really thinking about that. That could be just like a really critical and important thing. Stuff like commitment and contracting between agents. Like, I don't know, this is like not that important right now because of the ways in which agents interact, but as soon as they're kind of doing things in the real world for us, like forming these agreements and forming this trust between agents is going to be super important. But there's a whole infrastructure that's needed there that just like people haven't built yet. Negative examples, things you shouldn't do. Creating an LLM meeting assistant that moderates meetings and discussions. Yay, but it's helping with cooperation, and it's using language models, which is like at the frontier, so this is really cool. Well, great, apart from like 1 billion other people are already trying to do this, and many of them have like startups and are like throwing a bunch of money at it, and we're gonna have this in like 6 to 9 months anyway. And so just like working on it as a PhD student is like basically pointless. Helping self-driving cars to coordinate at junctions. The self-driving car companies are just going to figure this out, right? You don't need, you're not going to help anything by like figuring this out. Also, it's like just not that big of a deal. Like, yes, no one likes car crashes, but like this problem is just going to be solved. So like, don't worry about it. This is not your problem to solve. Okay, I felt like I ended the presentation on kind of like a bit of a downer, which I didn't really want to do. I was just kind of like being mean about research directions. I think it's actually best if I don't hand over for questions right now, but if you want to talk about any of this stuff, you should come chat to me in the break.